Today, we continue our season of healing with two different stories. The first is Jesus healing a centurion slave, and the second is Jesus raising a widow's son from death. Last week, we looked at what healing might mean and how we might consider it to be a restoration point instead of a point of perfection. Today, though, the stories are not about restoring a withered hand. They are about two very different people being healed and two very different people receiving the benefits of those healings. In the NRSV that we use to read the scriptures from, the title of the first story is Jesus Heals a Centurion's Servant. And in the text, it makes it quite clear that the person being healed is a slave. Now, since there's a big difference in understanding between a servant and a slave, I'm going to talk about the person being a slave. A slave is a person who has no voice, no status. And while he was valued by the centurion, we don't know why. It could have been something as simple as this slave was a good worker. Let's not portray the decision as one of kindness on behalf of the centurion, because we don't know. It could have been just to maintain his own gain. What we do know about a centurion is that he would have been in the middle of the hierarchy of the Roman army. Certainly, he would have had men to command, probably about 80 or so, and he would have had commands himself that he would have to follow. We hear that some Jewish elders spoke up for him and that he had been instrumental in making sure that their synagogue was built. It would be safe to say that this centurion had some real authority in the Roman structure. And it would be safe to say that he had some implied authority in the Jewish people around him. This would not have been an easy balance for him to maintain. In the second story, we have some similarities with the first and some differences. The son, being dead, has no voice, no status, and would have certainly been valued by his mother. And again, before we go attributing some great relationship between the mother and son, we know that a widow was a very vulnerable person in biblical times, and having a son would have made her less vulnerable. Now, it takes me considerable effort to think about the situation that the widow was in. The widows I know today, and even the widowers I know, are not as vulnerable as widows were in biblical times. While losing a loved one always makes us a bit vulnerable, rarely these days are widows unable to provide for themselves. Maybe the widows I know are just incredible people, and they are. However, there's more than that. Unlike the centurion in the first story, a widow would have had no real or even implied authority in biblical times. I alluded to this question last week. Who gets healed and why? As I pray my own prayers for healing for myself and for others, God often seems to answer those prayers in ways that aren't always consistent with my prayers. Which makes me wonder, why aren't my prayers answered in the way that I ask them to be? And when we look at the centurion, a foreigner, not one who would have followed the teachings of Judaism. And when we look at the widow, who didn't even appeal to Jesus for her son to be raised from the dead, it seems unfair to have their prayer and their unspoken prayers answered, and not mine, and potentially not yours. What if these stories weren't supposed to illustrate Jesus' power to heal? We heard last week that the healing of the man with the withered hand was set in two stories about authority, and that led to another purpose for the healing story, that Jesus had authority to restore people. What if the very purpose of today's stories was to illustrate not authority, but the generosity of our God? Can God reply to the cries of people we would think are non-believers? Can God respond to those who are so struck with their situation that they can't even voice their own needs? It's an important part of our understanding about God that our God is a generous God. And yes, there are times that generosity seems unfair, extravagant to some, misplaced for others. However, that generosity that God offers is offered to us as well. Maybe not to make our lives perfect, and maybe not to make the lives of others perfect either. But that generosity helps restore us to a stable place. Healing, wholeness, and most importantly, restoration is offered to everyone from our loving and generous God. And for that, we give thanks. Amen.